Welcome to Revive Ministries Podcast. This month, we're discussing healing our communities, tribute to National Wellness Month. There's a quote from Margaret Wheatley. She says that there is no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Today, we have a new guest, Dr. Allen Lycka. Is that correct in saying Lycka?
Lycka is how I pronounce it.
Lycka. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight on this topic.
Thank you for having me. It really is a privilege to be here.
Well, I always feel like my when I think about podcasts, everyone looks at views and downloads. I just look at how the guests want to keep coming back. So you may get another invitation later on, Dr. Allen Lycka.
Yes, correct. And if you have me back, I'd be delighted to come back at any time.
I want to share with those listening a disclaimer. If you're in the United States, they just started the 988 Suicide Crisis Lifeline. If you are in crisis, wherever you are around the world, resources are different. Resources are different for each individual. I encourage you to find what is out there. I always say, Dr. Allen, that people say it better than I, and that's totally fine. Confucius, a long time ago, said it this way: the man who moves a mountain begins by carrying away small stones. What comes to mind when you hear this?
That means to me that this has got to all start with baby steps.
Yeah.
You can't do it with giant strides.
Mm-hmm.
All life starts with baby steps. And if you can take those tiny little steps, I think Confucius also said, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step.
Yeah.
So that, I think, is where you have to start it all.
I think sometimes, it's nice to have, I'm not to discredit those big milestones, but a lot of times in recovery, whether it's physical, mental health, or what have you, it can be discouraging when you're having those little steps, when you're like, well, I'm not making as much progress as what I think I should. But when you understand that the progress, these little steps matter. They all build to something. I really appreciate.
Life is kind of funny. Sometimes it's one step forward and two steps back.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a funny dance that goes on. So I don't want people to be discouraged when they're trying to make some progress. Quite often, you'll take several steps and not see anything happen. And then all of a sudden, you'll see a huge amount of progress after a given period of time. So that shouldn't be a reason to discourage you. You should keep moving forward. And if you keep moving forward, you will make progress.
I want to ask you, Dr. Allen, would you mind, you're a new guest, would you mind sharing a little about yourself, what your story, what brought you here and what you're doing today?
Sure. I was a leading cosmetic dermatologist when in 2003, my life changed abruptly. I was walking with my wife in Disneyland, the happiest place on earth. and my wife turned to me and she said, "What's wrong with you, hon?" I said, "Dear, I don't know what you're talking about." She said, "Listen to your foot." I said, "Dear, again, I don't know what you're talking about. That's one of the funniest things you ever said." She said, "Your foot, it's flapping." And so I listened to my foot, and my right foot had suddenly and mysteriously developed a right foot drop. It was flapping on the pavement with each step I was taking. Now your brain is programmed so that your foot lifts up with each step you take. Mine wasn't doing that. It wasn't doing the thing it was supposed to do. My wife said, "Did you have a stroke?" I said, "Dear, I don't think so. If I had a stroke, I'd be lying on the pavement muttering something unintelligible." Well, she said, "You need to get this checked out. When you get back, you better get this checked out." Now, when your wife gives you that ultimatum, Robert, what do?
You do what she says.
You do what she says. If you know what's good for you, you do what she says. So I got it checked out. And, I went to see a couple of doctors, which led to more doctors, which led to more doctors. And by the end, I had seen hundreds of doctors. And They had done CAT scans. They had done brain scans. They had done scans. And you know what they showed at the end of the day?
What was that?
Absolutely nothing. There was nothing wrong with any of those tests. So, when a doctor finds nothing wrong, he does more tests and more tests and more tests. So I had every test known to man at that time. And at the end of it, there was still nothing wrong. So they got together and they decided to send me to a world-class neurologist. Now, a neurologist is the brain guy. He's got all the answers to all these difficult questions. So I walked in and I said, hi. He said, hi back, but you better be sitting down when I tell you this. I said, why? I've got a dropped right foot. He said, no, you don't. You have ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He said, get your affairs in order because in 6 months you're going to be dead. I was taken aback. It was like he hit me. I said, is there a way to prove this diagnosis? He said, of course, on autopsy. That's a crude thing for anybody to say.
Yeah.
A very crude thing to say. And I got mad. I said, I'm not going to die to prove you wrong. So the answer is, when you go through something like this, you go through the phases of death and dying that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote in her book on death and dying. You go through anger. You're angry at the world. Why?
Yeah.
Because you've just been told you're going to die. So you let all this anger explode inside of you. You go through bargaining. Oh God, please don't let this happen. I'll do anything if you don't let this happen. You go through denial. There's nothing wrong. I can do anything. There's nothing. But I have a dropped right foot. And through all this, my right hand started not working properly. So I had to start using my left hand more. And I became totally left-handed, whereas before I was right-handed. And then you go through depression. Have you ever been depressed?
Yes, I have.
It's a terrible place to be in. It's what I call the black spot. You can't sleep, you can't eat, you stare at the ceiling all day. Why? Because you're going to die anyhow. Why do anything? I had seen people die of ALS, and I knew how bad that was. So I wasn't going to let that happen. If I was going to die, I was going to commit suicide before that happened. And before I did that, I went to my wife and I said, dear, what do I have? She said, I haven't got the faintest idea, she said, but you're smart, you'll figure it out. I said, dear, I've seen hundreds of doctors, they couldn't figure it out. And she said, well, perhaps you haven't seen the right doctor yet. Now that was brilliant, but how do you see all the doctors in the world when you've seen them all already? So, back in 2003, something brand new was invented. You might have heard about it, Robert. It's called the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that really was a beautiful thing. But back in 2003, to get onto it, you couldn't get on like you do now.
No.
You didn't have Dr. Google to help you.
No.
You had a dial-on connection where your phone went on a cradle and it went ria, for something like 15 minutes. And finally, you were able to connect to someone on the other side.
Yeah.
Now, the beautiful thing about all this is I had friends that were nerds, and they helped me navigate the internet. And we found a doctor in Colorado Springs, Colorado, by the name of David Martz, that had a story very similar to mine. Now, David was a wonderful man, but he got sick much more rapidly. And within weeks of his diagnosis, he was in his deathbed. Doctors from around the world were coming to say goodbye to David. They loved him so much. And a doctor came up from Texas and looked at David and said, David, there's something wrong with this picture. I don't think you have ALS. He said, what do I have? The guy from Texas said, I think you have chronic Lyme's disease. I think you've been bitten by a tick. And I think that tick has caused a disease that's mimicking ALS. Well, David said, what do I do? And the doctor from Texas said, you need do nothing. I'll start you on treatment. And if I'm right, I'll get you better. Now, David said, what do I have to lose? I'm dying. So he started him on treatment. And a miracle happened. Like Lazarus, he arose from the dead. Within 2 weeks, he was back to his usual self. Now, David started a treatment center to help people with this weird disease. He called it the Rocky Mountain Chronic Disease Center. Now, I didn't know how to get in touch with it. I didn't know how to do it. So I phoned every hospital in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I got in touch with them at the Methodist Hospital. And there, we talked for hours. And David invited me down to find out if I could help me. So I flew down. It was a great flight, except for the flight from Denver to Colorado Springs. That was a rinky-dink puddle jumper. It was an awful flight. It was like the drop of doom at Disneyland over and over and over again. So after 15 minutes of the flight, I crawled off, and there was David on the tarmac to meet me. And there he was. He said, let's go talk. And he said, Dr. Lycka, I think something miraculous is going to happen. I think history is repeating itself. So he started me on treatment. And that's how I was able to stay as a top cosmetic doctor until 2019 when I walked away.
It's just amazing. A lot of times, just to have every doctor at that moment see you and say, and then the last one being the world renowned to say you have ALS, and your wife, beside every good man is a good wife. She says, maybe you got the wrong diagnosis, and you go ahead and through the internet, the magic of the internet, as we know, can be magical. You found this place, and I find it, hearing it, I can't imagine. It seems easier. I'm not discrediting you. I'm just saying it's easier to hear the words, but I can't imagine the time you spent waiting on each thing, waiting to get connected to Rocky. I can't even imagine that.
It was a difficult journey. I paraphrased the journey here, but it was an emotional roller coaster. It was a terrible time in my life. But at the same time, there were no resources to help either. And I have to caution people about the internet. The internet is dangerous as well as miraculous.
Yes.
Just as many quacks are out there as there are people that are willing to help you. So the listener has to be very careful about the thing. I always say the internet is like the world's best library, but it's full of garbage cans. And you can't tell the garbage cans from the great resources that are there.
Yeah. And it's just more inspiring that you in the sense, and this is where this question propagates, navigating through misdiagnosis and not giving up is extremely hard. What kept you moving forward? I know, for me, if I hear everyone, and I've been through every scan and test, and they're saying, this is what it is, and get your, as tactless as that doctor was, you were seeing the effects. You were only using your left hand. It's like, so I find that inspiring. The internet, like you said,
I was mortified through all of this. Remember, I went through a great depression with all this, and I was very, very sad by all this as well. So I was really taken aback by many of the diagnoses and the things that were going on. I don't blame the doctor for making a bad diagnosis. A person can only know what they know.
Yeah.
And even now, in 2022, there are doctors who claim that chronic Lyme's disease does not exist. There are doctors that argue that. Now, I find that interesting because we now have COVID disease and we now have chronic COVID disease. And no one is debating the fact that there's chronic COVID disease there. But there's people that debate the fact that chronic Lyme's disease exists.
And why do you think that is? Just asking.
Again, doctors are people that get locked in paradigms. Doctors are not perfect. Doctors get locked in certain. And I like the analogy of 4 blind men examining an elephant. Now, one blind man looks at the elephant and feels the trunk and says, wow, this is what an elephant is like. Another one examines the tail and says, this is what the elephant's like. Another one examines a foot and says, this is what it's like. And finally, one examines the body and says, this is what it's like. All in all, doctors can only know what they know. They cannot know what they do not know. And that's the difficulty we have with this. Is doctors are human like anybody else. Now, how did I know that there could be wrong diagnosis? Well, I was a dermatologist. And as a dermatologist, I learned the art of diagnosing depended on something called a differential diagnosis. When my teachers taught me to learn about skin disease, they always taught me to put a list of things down that a diagnosis could be. So, when you're looking at a skin rash, you always have a favorite guess, but there's 5 or 10 other things that it could be. And those always go on your list as well. And that is the difficulty many doctors don't see, is things are not black and white. They're often a shade of gray.
I want to ask you, as we're continue on this story, inspiring story, what advice would you suggest to someone listening today who is struggling in the midst of confusion of finding appropriate help and navigating them in the care that may help move them things forward?
I think they should go and first of all and get a second opinion. And if that doesn't work, get a third opinion, because I think those things are very important. Remember, I told you, doctors can only know what they know. They cannot know what they do not know. So it's very important to know that and think of those things as well. And find out something that might work for you. And, this is I look back at the start of COVID disease. Before COVID was first diagnosed, we didn't even think of that diagnosis. Yet it's one of the most commonly diagnosed diagnoses right now. This is the way life goes. New things always come along. And if a person is in something and has been diagnosed, keep on going. Keep on looking for things. Keep on finding somebody that might give you the diagnosis that might help you.
My wife has this one book. It's Untranslatable Words in Other Countries. And I use a word each time. I usually mess up the pronunciation. But in Hindi, it's Jugad. It says, ensuring things happen even with minimal resources. I feel sometimes being, able to, sometimes, especially in my line of work in the mental health field, is that resources are like silos. They are not usually communicated well a lot of times, and resources are different. There's tangible resources. There's a lot of different kind of needs out there. And I feel, especially what you're sharing with us on, this month is National Wellness Month for this country, and I feel it is important for us to know that we can get a second opinion. It's important for us to know that when it comes to health, it's not black and white. And sometimes when your story, I feel, at least for me, it inspires me to, not only just to actually, when it comes to my health, if I'm having trouble or anything else, to dive a little bit deeper and ask your, because let me just say this way. The situation might be complicated, what you're going through, your diagnosis, whatever you're feeling, but the reason you're trying to get better is simple. Why we're trying to get the healing going a lot of times is simple. I want to be better so I can feel better, be a better husband, whatever chronic or whatever I'm dealing with, whatever depression, I try to find the help that I need. Any final thoughts, Dr. Allen, on anything that you want to share with those listening, what you're doing today, as we kind of wrap things up?
Well, I think one of the things I like to emphasize to people is it's not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens. You have to take 100% responsibility for your health and your stuff. You can't blame others for it. You can't be a victim, you have to be a victor. And you yourself have to take responsibility for that. So please do that. Get off your couch, start doing things that'll move you forward. Keep on going. And if you need help and resources, there's people out there that can help you. I do offer some help in some people's way. I no longer practice medicine, but I do coaching. I do help people in other ways. So people can turn to me on the website, drallenlycka.com. DRALLEN Lycka LYCKA.com. And if I can be of any further assistance in that, please let me know.
A lot of times our environment plays a big role in this, and I always say lately, accountability is not a bad word when it's a safe place. When we don't have that idea that I have to be right the first time, we understand that there is that level of learning and growing, and it's inspiring to hear just what you went through and where you are today, Dr. Allen. I want to say thank you for coming on, joining on this discussion, and I will share the notes on all the links to those who are listening will be in the notes, so you can learn more about Dr. Allen Lycka and everything that he's doing. Thank you again, Dr. Allen. It's wonderful to have you on.
Well, thank you for having me. And if I can be of further assistance and service to your listeners, I would love to do so.
And like I said, I always feel I love the idea with Revive Ministries that we can continue these discussions, and I denote my success in the fact that I have the discussion continue. I really appreciate you being part of that, Dr. Allen.
Okay, bye for now. And again, people, reach out for help if you need help.
Remember to stay updated. Those who are listening to Revive Ministry through the various platforms, ReviveMinistryFL.com is our website. This is goodbye from Revive Ministry Podcast, leaving me with this last quote. It's from Coretta Scott King. So the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members.